Good morning. I'm Kathy Tunheim. I apologize that we're a minute or two late. We had a couple of little technical glitches, but welcome to a conversation with some wonderful leaders in our community to begin what we at Tunheim think is an important conversation to get started. We know that there are some of these conversations already happening in other venues. We're excited to be a part of this as a communications and public affairs consulting firm. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome some friends and guests to help us with the conversation. And as we get started this morning, I'm going to be calling on some of my colleagues at Tunheim to share data so that we can all at least begin to wrap our arms and our minds around the kinds of investment that appear to be heading our way. Some decisions already made in Washington and in St. Paul, we think, given how late things went last night, but lots of decisions yet to be made. So welcome to this conversational look at one-time federal funds. Again, I'm Kathy Tunheim, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome you here. My guests, I'm going to introduce them now, and then we're going to turn, as I said, to some data. But first, Tonya Allen, who is new to Minnesota earlier this year. She joins us as the president of McKnight Foundation. Tonya, thanks very much for being with us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Myron Frans, a name that's familiar to many of us. Myron spent a dozen years in state government, first as Commissioner of Revenue in the Dayton administration, and then the Commissioner of Management and Budget for both Governor Dayton and and Governor Walz. Myron, good morning. Myron is now the Chief Financial Officer at the University of Minnesota, my alma mater. Welcome, Myron.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Kathy.
And last but certainly not least, the Honorable Dave Kleis, who's the mayor of St. Cloud, serves that wonderful city after also a time of service at the state legislature. Mayor, thanks for being with us.
Morning, happy to be here.
Great. And for technical reasons, the mayor does not answer to the name Ginny Melvey, but the link we've got him on, in fact, identifies that, so don't be confused by that. Thanks again for being with us, Dave.
The new nick.
Yeah, that's right. As we were joking with him, he's been called many things, but Ginny's a new one for him. Before we get into a conversation with these experienced leaders, as I said, I want to ask a couple of my colleagues at Tunheim to just join us for a minute and share some data to get our heads wrapped around this topic. First, I'm going to call on the president of Tunheim, John Blackshaw, who I've asked to just do a very quick summary of what's the money that's already been authorized and to some extent arrived in Minnesota. John, can I call on you to take us through that quickly?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. Good morning, everyone. Go to the first slide, please. There's a lot of money that has been appropriated by Congress that is flowing into the states. In front of you are the 6 major pieces of legislation that has come out of Congress in the last year to 14 months. We started back in March of 2020 with the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act. Each one of these bills had a specific purpose coming out of for Congress. Some of them were directed at the coronavirus itself. Some of it was directed at stimulus for small businesses and other large companies. Some of it was directed at individuals themselves. We're not going to go through each one of these. We're going to call out a couple of them as they apply to the states that were recipients of several pieces of legislation. The 2 that I'm going to call out and we're going to talk a little bit more about is the CARES Act, which is number 3 there, often referred to as the stimulus bill. And then the last piece of legislation, which is the American Rescue Plan Act, which is just passed in Congress. Next slide, please. Minnesota has received or is going to receive under those 6 particular pieces of legislation about $12.8 billion in relief and recovery funds. Of that, about 85% comes from 2 specific acts, which is the CARES Act, which is known as the stimulus bill, and then the American Rescue Plan that was just signed by President Biden in March of this last year. The other two, which are more directed at individuals and families, represent about 15% of the $12.8 billion in relief. Next slide, please. The CARES Act itself, which is known as the Stimulus Act, I will just note this. In just a minute, my colleague Sarah is going to talk about what's to come in terms of congressional action. And I know this all can get very confusing because there's a lot of acts and there's a lot of money at play. The CARES Act itself, as you can see, we've broken down some of it in terms of where the money is going. 29%, the large share of it is in Corona Relief Fund, and it's a local portion of that. 24% of that is program specific, and program specific can mean anything from the specifics having to do with mandatory child development funds, women and infant children's. So they're very specific distributions or earmarks for that money. In the CARES Act itself, there's about $150 billion available to state and local governments. And that money is yet to be designated. It's up to the states and the local governments to determine, within boundaries, determine where that money goes to. The next fund. The next slide, please. This is the American Rescue Plan breakdown. This is what was most recently passed by Congress. And as you can see, 39% of it, the lion's share of it, will be program specific, which is yet to be determined in terms of how that money gets spent. 21 of our major cities is going to get about $700 million to spend. And then 35% of this money will go to state specific recovery funds. I hope that was a good overview of where some of the money is. It can get very confusing, but needless to say, there is a lot of money that is coming into the state that yet to be determined how it gets spent.
Thanks, John. As I said to him, he gets 3 minutes to talk about trillions of dollars. So
Yeah.
We appreciate that. And again, I think the point of our conversation today is that we believe we all need to be paying attention to this and starting to think about what's possible in our communities with this, what I keep calling sort of perhaps once in a generation infusion of federal dollars, and getting a grounding of what's already been determined and what hasn't been is a place to start. But as John mentioned, another of our colleagues, Sarah Hind, can you just come on, Sarah, and talk a little bit about what we know about what may still be coming?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Kathy. As one of my roles here at Tunheim is I'm working with some of our clients to look forward to the future. The money that might be coming in is part of Biden's overall Build Back Better agenda, which includes the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan, to track the progress through Congress and do some advocacy work to advocate for a lot of the provisions in the proposal to come to Minnesota and to reap some of those benefits. So what you see on the screen here is actually Biden's original proposal. And these are the things that make up his, what's called the Build Back Better agenda. And then within that, it's the American Families Plan, the American Jobs Plan. What you see on the screen right now has virtually zero chance of going through exactly as you see it. So as it goes through the congressional process, it's definitely going to change, shuffle, and move around a bit, but that gives you a good overall picture of where things started. And it is a consistently moving target. Biden's plan, as originally proposed, is going to have difficulty getting through the Senate through the traditional legislation process due to the 60-vote threshold in the Senate. The plan itself does have consistently strong polling across the country of all political parties among the electorate. But within the elected Congress, Republicans have taken some issue with the overall size of the package and the broadness in which Biden defines infrastructure, because it's not just roads and bridges. He has the whole section on human infrastructure. And last week, it's been in the news, I'm sure you've all heard, that a deal was struck, and a group of bipartisan senators and President Biden announced a $1.2 trillion compromise infrastructure package, which would primarily support the more traditional forms of infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, highways, and then there's some smaller investments in things like transit and electrical grid modernization. At the same time, Democratic senators also announced on the same day that the more progressive pieces of Biden's proposal, such as the climate and environmental justice initiatives and what is referred to as human infrastructure, which is the personal care attendants and childcare and things like that, would move through the budget reconciliation process, which of course is a process that allows fiscal items to move through the Senate without having to be subject to that 60 vote threshold. Biden originally pledged and was backed by Senators Schumer and Speaker Pelosi that he would not sign the bipartisan infrastructure bill unless the reconciliation package moved and was presented along with it at the same time, and that he expected to see both pieces of legislation by October 1st. But right away, there was some GOP backlash to that, and Biden quickly walked that back a bit. And that's kind of where we stand today. We don't know exactly how these are going to move forward. We don't know if they're going to move together. We don't know if Biden will not sign one without the other. But it is important to remember there is still no actual legislation resulting from last week's development, and neither the bipartisan package nor the reconciliation package have been introduced yet. So this is far from a done deal, and it's still uncertain exactly how it will play out. There are GOP senators who say they will pull back their support on the infrastructure package if reconciliation moves with it. And at the same time, there are Democratic senators saying they will pull back their support on the infrastructure package if reconciliation does not move with it. So we're kind of at a standstill today on what will happen in the Senate with that. And pieces of the plan are continuing to move through the House in chunks, and House members are going to do their best to influence their Senate colleagues, but the ultimate fate of the package is going to rest in the Senate. Any organization who is hoping to see a strong package or receive and benefit from potential funding, now is the time to start taking an active approach if an organization has not done so. The advocacy work being done now to influence members of the congressional delegation will make a difference on what the size and scope of the package looks like, and then at the same time start level setting and positioning for when the money does come in. And I'm sure there is going to be several developments on this front in the next week. Things are changing very quickly, but the important thing to remember is there's a potential deal, but still no legislation. So it's gonna probably be a while yet.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. And as Sarah mentioned, part of her role at Tunheim is to keep an eye on this very dynamic situation on behalf of a few of our clients. So more to come. And as we have opportunities to gather again and talk about this over the coming months, Sarah will continue to be one of those people who helps us get a grip on what's actually happening there. So thanks, Sarah. Myron, I want to call you into this conversation at this point, and just again, we've quickly breezed through trillions of dollars. Put this kind of one-time money into perspective for us as we think about decisions we have to make in our businesses, in our communities, for our state, how to think about this extraordinary scenario.
Well, good. Glad to. Thank you, Kathy. One-time money is kind of hard to spend. I think people sometimes forget the fact that unless it's construction or building or infrastructure, which is good, don't get me wrong, those commitments are great to engage in. But if you're really talking about services and improving performance of schools or other agencies, you're talking about time. And one of the good things about the plan, that some of the stuff that I've read from Biden's plan, is that the money is to be spent over 8 years. So I think we need to contextualize this a little bit in the sense that it will take a little bit of time. Senator Anderson will talk a bit more here in a few minutes about the legislative role, but he will remember that when we got about $2 billion last year from the federal government, it was a challenge to spend it in terms of how to spend it, where to spend it, and the mechanisms in place. If you look at the overall money that John mentioned, that's about a 20% increase to a $50 billion biennial budget, general fund budget. So that's a lot of money coming in at one time. So I think one of the things that people are going to need to figure out when some of this money comes to state government or local governments and figuring out how that it gets spent, it's going to be really incumbent upon local officials and state officials to figure out ways to do it that has transparency, people can be engaged in, because clearly no one group knows the best answer. I mean, we're all, as Paul Wilson used to say, we're all smarter when we all work together. And so I think that that's one of the challenges, and that's hard to do because there's a lot of disagreement over how to allocate these funds. But that transparency process and that engaged process, as Sarah's mentioning, now is the time to get engaged. But that's really, I think, a critical step, because the so-called government infrastructure isn't there in some cases to do some of these things. And so, we've had, I would argue, now my friend Senator Anderson may disagree, but I think we've had several decades of disinvestment in services and state government. If you look at state government as an opportunity and a mechanism to help facilitate programming and changes across the state in big ways, we've really seen a reduction from the Minnesota Miracle back in 1971 that Kathy will remember, where we really did some restructuring in terms of funding for schools, disparity among school districts, local aid to cities and counties. That worked for several decades quite well, but it's been really dismantled in many ways in the last about a couple of decades ago. I think we're starting to restore some of that, but I do believe that part of what we're seeing is going to get us back to where we were before. So as we talk about transformational, I agree, and I'm really optimistic about the transformational aspect of what President Biden's talking about. But frankly, some of it is getting back to levels of commitment that we haven't seen in 20, 30, 40 years. And that's just critical now. But one of the reasons that Sarah mentioned is polling really well. I think one of the main reasons it's polling well is because virtually everyone benefits. So it's just a smart proposal in the sense of when you're talking about disadvantaged communities, families, farmers, workers, businesses. I mean, there's hardly anybody left out of this package, and the sheer size of it. I think we've seen so many packages in the past be so focused on particular groups. This one's got a little bit of something for everybody, which is obviously a smart political move, but it's also pretty savvy on the Biden administration's part. But anyway, so my comment about the size and scope of this is that it will cause some challenges for state, local, county governments to work with the private sector. We need to do more of this public-private partnership opportunities where we're working together. Now, governments aren't really set up to do that very well sometimes, unfortunately, and we need to get a little bit better at exercising those muscles. But if we coordinate this in the right way and envision these opportunities for people to come together, talk about these big buckets of money, because I think if we don't really do that, we'll miss the opportunity to get people engaged. So anyway, so Kathy, that's sort of my initial thought about where this money comes from, how we use it.
Thanks very much, Myron. I think I want to come back to one of the points you just made, and that is that because government isn't set up necessarily to have the kind of engagement that would inform how to spend all this money, it's really the rationale for this conversation. And as I mentioned once already, and I'll keep saying it, we'll intend over time to do this again and keep sharing information as it becomes clear. But one of the other things you just mentioned, Myron, is that there is some of this money going directly to cities. And I want to call on my colleague, Emmett Coleman, to give us a quick setup on that. And then Mayor Kleis, I'll give you the heads up that I'm coming to you after he's had a chance to share that. So Emmett Coleman.
Good morning. Yeah, as we've discussed already, there's a lot of money coming, and I think people traditionally think of federal money as going directly through the state Oftentimes there's a couple of counties, however, that traditionally get money directly from the federal government. But this is really a unique situation in the American Rescue Plan that for the first time in decades, that there is just a direct stream of money from the federal government to all counties in Minnesota, so covering the entire state, but also to all cities across the state. And there are 21 cities, these ones here that you can see on your screen, they're considered entitlement cities. They're over 50,000 in population. And these cities are already receiving direct funding from the federal government. They'll receive 2 payments 12 months apart. And these communities have already begun to receive these funds, and they'll get a second dose directly from the federal government. So they're already in the midst of trying to decide how to spend this money. They have, it's important to note for these cities, they have until December 31st of 2024 to spend this money. So even though they've already gotten funds now, and they're going to get another second round of payment in 12 months, they have time to step back and take a breath. Many cities have already gone out and said, this is how we're going to use this money. They're already kind of making, individual community decisions as is appropriate. But this is really, as Myron said, really unique one-time transformational money. And so these communities are getting funds directly. But I also want to point out that there are, cities across the state will also have access to the money if they don't get it directly. There's other cities that aren't 50,000 in population or over, are called non-entitlement units, strange name, but those communities can work directly with the state of Minnesota, and they're eligible for up to $100 per resident in their communities. And it's important to note that not only do they have to work with the state, but for those cities that determine either intentionally or unintentionally not to work with the state to go after those funds, the state then has the ability to redirect, reallocate those funds, as I understand it. So it's important for communities to know they have access to the money, but for these non-entitlement 21 cities over 50,000, they have to actively go look for this money, and they have to work with the state to get it. But it is an opportunity for communities across the entire state of Minnesota, not just in the metro area or large urban areas, to really to get this money. But step back just a quick second from that. I think, again, there are some cities that are already moving forward aggressively to kind of decide this, but we have 2 years. There's really an opportunity here to try to come together, I think, around 1 or 2 larger priorities. I know that in addition to this conversation that we're having and other ones that we're hoping to have in the future, we've got partner organizations that we have strong relationships, like the Center for Economic Inclusion, that is starting to have these very same conversations. The center was actually hoping to have a briefing this morning with somebody from Brookings, I believe, to talk about what some of the other cities across the country are doing. They had to postpone that, but they will reschedule that. And I encourage people to stop for a second, take a breath, and think about, what do you know about these funds? What do you know about the priorities, not just in your community, but when we talk about things like affordable housing, or we talk about wealth creation across the cities? There's a real opportunity for us, and how do we use these funds? Yeah,
thanks, Emmett. And I'll give another plug to the Center for Economic Inclusion that Emmett just mentioned. I know a part of that conversation that they're looking to convene involves some other mayors like Jim Hovland, who are wondering if some of the community should work together and create some, in his mind, a racial equity fund that enables municipalities to do some partnering work and create some sense of shared objectives. So yeah, lots of creativity. But we have Mayor Dave Kleis with us from St. Cloud, one of those entitlement cities. Mayor, I'd love to just get yours, to the extent you're able to share. What's this experience been like, to be on the receiving end of this kind of federal attention, and just talk a little bit about how it's been experienced in St. Cloud.
Oh, it's I think the biggest challenge, and I think is always the biggest challenge, is when there's additional revenue coming in. Folks think of a lot of different ways of spending it. I think that's my time in the legislature, I think, was the same thing. Every time we had a budget surplus, it was much more challenging to reallocate allocate funds there than when you have a shortfall. We experienced, of course, last year as a city, a significant shortfall in revenue. That was our biggest challenge. We had a $10 million shortfall last year. We projected pretty significantly, almost that same for this calendar year that we're in. So if you look at, for us, looking at about a $20 million revenue reduction and receiving federal funds of about 16 million, we're still down. But the challenge is, most of the public, you hear a headline, and actually I have the same challenge with my council. They see 16 million additional dollars without, and forgetting about the fact that we're 20 million down to begin with, and the revenue shortfall. And for us, at least the legislation allows that, as mentioned, that 4 years, and the ability, we're still trying to figure out what the rules are as to how we can use those dollars also. And before we make some of those major decisions, we want to make sure that we're staying within the guidelines. There's a lot more flexibility here than there was in the CARES. There's a lot more flexibility in some of the direct appropriations that we receive. But our challenge is, and some of our funds are in fact, I'll give you an example. Some of the spending we use on bonds for some of our enterprise funds, for parking system, for our convention center, and all of those. Now, we did receive some direct money through the state, again, through the CARES Act, I believe, went to the state, and we got some dollars for our Rivers Edge Convention Center. But most of that revenue relies on food and beverage tax. For almost a year, there's really no food and beverage tax or hotel motel tax. Sales tax was down. Water usage was down at the beginning last year. So our costs and some of our utilities were down. So all that revenue loss, we still had to pay those bills. We still had to pay the bond. Our parking system, for example, in our downtown, we lost 75% of that revenue. So you take a hit like that, and you still have to pay the bond payments. So those things, they're backed by the revenue bonds. They're backed up by general obligation. So we were able to use property tax, but then again, how do we fill that hole with where those dollars would go? So it really is in some of our partners, I think the concept of partnering, we partner already on a lot of things, but some of our partners also had that significant revenue loss. So we lost that partnership and that revenue. So it made it a challenge. I think the biggest challenge for us is where we put those dollars and getting, at least from the public perspective, that we're plugging some holes, first of all. And holes are pretty significant in dollars, but we're also looking at, and I think that's an important piece, where we are, as I think Myron said, going out several years. And we're, in our infrastructure part, is some of the holes that we had to put off some major projects last year because we couldn't bond. The municipal bond market was almost non-existent at the beginning of that year. So when we were going into a construction cycle, we had to hold off on those projects. Now, those projects became more expensive this year. And in some cases, we just don't have the material, and it's difficult to do. So there was a huge cost increase from last year. So we understand, we're hopeful that we can use, I think in some of the legislation, we can use those funds to go forward with those projects. So our focus on that one-time money is going into the infrastructure projects we would have had last year, but they have become more expensive to do. So for us, it's just trying to navigate, the dollars, and of course we're also, for example, the fact that I think that everyone is getting all these funds, that also made it a little bit challenging for us, because I think as a part of that, we're having a hard time, just with getting people. In fact, this year, one of the challenging things for us, just a little anecdotal piece. Lifeguards, we can't find lifeguards to run our, because for the first time there's a shortage of workers, and is part of that because everyone received a lot of money. Is part of that because there's a lot of pressure taken off of folks on the labor front. We already had a labor shortage before we went into the pandemic, and now it's really exacerbated. So we're looking at even some cost. I mean, what we pay part-time people, we can't even begin to get part-time people for. So there's going to inflationary cost for us in just in employees going forward, and so we're factoring in that too. What is that going to look like next year? So it's complicated for us, but I think the biggest challenge is people think there's a high expectation of dollars, and for us, we're trying to fill just a lot of those holes.
Yeah, Thanks very much, Mayor. I think your anecdote and the issues you shared harks back to a couple of the things that Myron said earlier. And when we get into some conversation, we'll talk more about this. And it's an important thing to remember that the pandemic and that a whole experience of the pandemic laid bare a number of things in our in how our systems operate, how our companies operate. And there are things that in our small business will never be the same as we were before the pandemic. And so then you have this potential infusion of money. And do we think of it as going back and filling holes, which we need to do some of, especially, I know you need to do that as a mayor. Do we also need to be taking this opportunity to think transformationally about doing something different? Myron's right. I was coming of age. My first job back in the state of Minnesota was just after what became known as the Minnesota Miracle. It wasn't called that when it was passed by the legislature, but we rethought how we invested in public education in a dramatic way, and it worked for a number of decades. Are we at one of those points? And are there certain conversations that we want to be having, public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, to reimagine how we move forward, given what we've been through in the past year or more, and with the opportunity of the kind of transformational funding that we might be looking at. And with that, it's kind of a segue. So thank you, Mayor, and we'll be back for some more conversation. Go ahead.
Just add to what you just said, I think is important, because in the Great Recession in 2008, that's exactly what we did, because at that time, of course, it was property tax. So we're in a different, property tax. We haven't seen that now, but then we did. So we did a lot of the partnering, and we did a lot of things that transformed actually to some of those revenues that this time around were reduced, and the property stayed stable. So you're right. We've been looking at the transforming even before the federal funds were coming, because we hoped, but we didn't expect them at that point. So you're right. Transformational time is clearly where we're at.
Yep. Thanks so much. We'll be back. Tonya, I want to take the opportunity to bring you into this conversation, though. As I mentioned at the outset, Tonya's joined the McKnight Foundation earlier this year, comes to us with extraordinary experience from Michigan. She's also currently the chair of the National Council on Foundations, and so brings a national perspective to this. And we're thrilled to have her as a leader now in our region. Just talk a little bit about both the things you've already heard here this morning, but also the work you've been doing around the country and spearheading things at McKnight. Just talk about this time and how philanthropy looks at the opportunity to move our communities forward.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. And thanks for allowing me to participate, because I'm learning as well as sharing what I know. And I think that what both Myron and the mayor said were right on. We have been in a state of emergency, as we all know, and that's why we've passed such large and big bills, and why there's such an influx of capital moving through our states, our cities. But I would just say that one of the challenges is that we've been in this emergency mode, and now we have to force ourselves to go to a mode of emergence. And to your point, and to the mayor's, Toni Morrison said, dream a little bit before you think. And that's what we have to spend our time doing right now, is actually dreaming a bit. And what I mean by that is this. One of the things that I was amazed about while we were in the middle of the pandemic was that we changed rules on the fly because we had to. And what's interesting about those rule changes that we made is that many of them were actually things that folks have been advocating for decades. And we saw that we could do them and the country could still run. And so I think the challenge before us today is really to figure out, how do we rethink and rewrite the rules so that we really come out of this moment, that we emerge as an inclusive economy, that we begin to integrate what we're hearing in the private sector about ESG standards. How do we make, and the president is forcing and encouraging us to do that with the federal dollars too. So how do we bridge that together? How do we create these public-private partnerships that really allow us to spend and make the investments in the things that have momentum? We got to make our municipalities and government whole, but we also will have these extra dollars that we need to invest strategically and smartly. And that those dollars, although of course we have invested, we elected our state and city leaders and county leaders, but the influx of dollars actually, I think, demand that we actually share power and rethink even how we distribute this money. I think it's important that we think about how we do two things. One is engage community, residents, other leaders in the discussion, which you are crafting, but again, we're third party, right? Like we need to have those conversations being initiated by government officials so that people really understand, because if we don't spend this money well, there will be significant backlash, and we will see, that it won't be additional investments coming in the way that we would want them to come, because people will have felt like that it was just poorly spent and poorly communicated. Yeah. And then the second thing that I would just say about around how we think about spending is, how do we use the nonprofit sector to be able to get those resources? So in the state, of course, we have the Minnesota Initiative Funds and Foundations, and then we also have community foundations. These are organizations that know how to get money into small organizations across the state. And part of our challenge, I think we'll need to do, is we got to figure out how to change hearts and minds with these resources too. We have to get people to be able to see what the future will look like if we make these investments well, particularly across greater Minnesota and even in the Twin Cities region as well. So we got to figure out how we use these resources to do multiple things. And if we're not clear about what our goals are and our aspirations, and clearly articulating those things so that we're deliberate and intentional, then I think we're going to miss the opportunity. To your point before about, the Minnesota Miracle, before, if we didn't know it then, but that branding still lands for us because we knew what we were trying to accomplish. So here's our moment. What's our brand? What's the message and the narrative we want to send, along with how we strategically spend these resources in conjunction with community and with business and the private sector?
Thanks, Tonya. What a great setup for the conversation that we want to have. And I can see that my colleagues are ready to have that conversation. I want to invite one more Tunheim partner, Paul Anderson, former state senator. And he's doing some public affairs consulting with us at Tunheim. We're thrilled to have him here. I asked him to the unenviable task of talking a little bit about how the legislature has to be thinking about this moment and the role that they need to play, both. And I think, as the mayor gave us a great example, we have infrastructure and ways we make decisions that exist today. This is an unusual moment. To what extent are we going to be relying on those traditional mechanisms for making decisions, and where do we need to be open to perhaps some innovation and transformational thinking? So Paul, welcome, and thanks for joining us. Just kind of your thoughts as a former legislator and a watcher of what happens in St. Paul.
Well, thanks, Kathy. And just imagine where we would be in the never-ending legislative session without the American Rescue Plan dollars. The state received $2.88 billion in ARPA funds. And, outside of the importance of understanding the guidelines of how the state could spend the money, and Commissioner Frans can go through all the steps with the CARES Act money and now the ARPA funds. Prior to the global agreement between the governor and the legislative leaders on May 17th, the big question was going to be who was going to have a say in the spending of the money. And the legislature, and I would say especially the Republican majority in the Senate, certainly wanted their input and their ability to spend that money. The last year I spent during COVID going through the CARES Act money, it was frustrating as somebody who had an election certificate, was there, saw needs in my community, in talking to legislators, understanding what needs to be done, but understanding that the executive branch had the power. So this was a big transformation that helped even these last few weeks. Those extra weeks were critical to go through the process, to understand how much money was available, how it was allocated, And in the end, about 1.5 billion of that was used to help balance the budget this session. So as they're concluding their work today, hopefully by midnight, that money has been allocated through many different things. Incredible, really historic investments in health and human services, historic investments in education, PPP loans and unemployment insurance tax reliefs, and many other provisions. The other big piece in the agreement was $500 million that was allocated to the governor for his use and his discretion to address health and economic impacts of the pandemic. So that will be ongoing, that he will have that fund. Some of it has already been, I think, determined. That's been in the press. And then with regards to what's left next year, the legislature is, and governor has agreed, they've kind of locked away about $800 to $900 million that can't be allocated until or spent until next June. So it'll be very interesting to see next session, depending on where the revenues are at for the state, whether or not they try and tap into that early, or we head into another special session where they can allocate that additional money. So it is critically important, I think, as these funds come in. I don't know if there'll be additional money coming in, but the legislature needs to have a say from my perspective. And I think you've seen over the last 4 weeks that work be done, and these historic investments will show for that.
Put you on the spot, Paul. Do you expect legislators to perhaps function differently in this next year, as in terms of seeking input about the decisions that need to get made next year?
Yeah, I think, we head into a policy year, of course, a traditional bonding year, a capital investment year. But again, we're going to have additional resources. I think you're seeing the tax receipts come in higher than expected. I think this is a ultimate wonderful time for input with legislators. As Mayor Kleis talked about, it's unusual when you have these surpluses, as Commissioner Frans knows very well. I used to tell people, if the state were to have a dollar deficit, everybody runs and hides because they don't want to get cut. But if there's a dollar available in surplus, everybody comes asking for a piece of that dollar. So as the additional funds are available, the input is absolutely critical from groups and associations and others to get that time with legislators and your own legislator to make sure that your priorities are known. And so as they're looking for guidance, because again, when the windfall comes, this historic investment from federal dollars, it's overwhelming. And so the more information and education you can do in advocacy, the better.
Thanks, Paul. And again, just a reminder, as Emmett kind of took us through it, there's this extraordinary amount of money that the state has to wrestle with. There are also funds coming directly to counties and to some cities, including yours, Mayor Kleis. So thank you, you guys, for kind of going through with us at this 30,000 feet, this quick overview of what's happening. Let's just talk for a little bit about this moment as civic leaders, each in your own way. Who should be thinking about this as a moment? This is a different time. It seems important to set the table for different kinds of conversation over this next number of months. As you've said, Myron, we're talking about over 8 years, the span of the spending of this kind of money. What's important from each of your perspectives about who informs the decisions, and what might we need to do differently to make sure that there are opportunities to inform the decisions? And Mayor, maybe I'm going to start with you, because I think, as you've said, you're already in it. You're having to make decisions to recover from the challenges of the past year with some tools that you didn't know you were going to have, you were hoping, but didn't know you'd have. Do you see the process of informing decisions evolving or changing in any specific ways for you in St. Cloud?
Well, I think, as I mentioned before, we started this with last year with that significant revenue shortfall, and we had it, and we see it into this year. So we've done a lot of the reforming and restructuring. The dollars that are coming in, that I think almost always makes it a challenge, because that's where people start thinking, okay, you've got these additional dollars. Here's all pent up over this period of time, and we're still trying to dig out of that last hole. We've done a lot of that restructuring, and based on last year, we're in our annual budgets that we're on a calendar year, so we had to make sure that our budget balance. At the same time, every single business and homeowner was experiencing a pretty rough time, so we weren't going to fees, we weren't going to raise property tax, and at the same time didn't have any revenue coming in to do all the services that people expected. Now with those dollars, it kind of gives you that time to say, and we did a lot of that restructuring. I mean, we our parking system, for example, I said we were down 75%. We automated the whole thing, which is good, because we couldn't find people now to work those systems. So that we were rethinking when we were down in that shortfall. It's a bigger challenge when there's dollars coming in, because now you have all these demands that might not have been there, and really, is that the prudent use of dollars? So we're still in the mindset of the shortfall, because these dollars are coming over a period of time. We still have to plug those gaps. So we're still reinventing, and also reinventing based on the fact that this showed us that, we used to rely on a lot of these user fees, user taxes. They were all almost gone, non-existent in some areas. So, and they're all back with different, revenue. How do we kind of insulate ourselves going forward in that, in a little bit different type of funding? And how do we partner? I mean, we're even looking at some cases where, some of the things that we do that is municipal, our Rivers Edge Convention Center, our parking system, maybe somebody else can do that in the private sector. So we're actually looking at different ways to partner and different ways to reduce that risk on some of those things that wouldn't be necessarily core city services. We did that in the Great Recession, and I think that helped. We're reevaluating. In fact, we dusted off all of what we did back then last year to get us through this period of time. We're also very cognizant of what is it going to look like. I mean, as mentioned before, property tax wasn't really affected for us in this last year. That wasn't the piece. But because of what happened last year, we're looking at office space, down our downtown. I mean, is that valuation going to go down? We've got a number of big employers that have had a lot of people online, and they're still going forward. In fact, I go back to parking because that's a good example. We have an employer that's in our downtown. They're probably about over a third of the revenue that goes into our parking system. They're not having their employees come back. They're all going to continue to be online. So we've lost a third of that revenue even going forward, even that we were down before. So how do we redo that? Our downtown's different, because of office space. Is that valuation of office property around the country, around the world for that matter, going to go down? Are we going to see that hit in the future? So we're actually looking more, I look more on how are we going to plug those holes? I mean, we do have some opportunity for some infrastructure, but I'm a little bit more concerned about what tails some of those, decisions are going to make, and how does that affect? And I'm also very cognizant of the state decisions because I've seen that. Myron and I know we were on a panel looking at, when did the sales tax begin in Minnesota? Part of the Minnesota miracle to help cities and counties and school districts. Where did that money eventually go? To the state. And then we keep thinking of how do we help cities, counties, and school districts forward on these things. So I think stepping back and still being prudent at what those revenue shortfalls, I'm more concerned about what the revenue shortfalls are now, were last year, and what they may be in the future before we make a lot of those decisions. But yeah, the public input part is right now what we focused on significantly, but making sure that people realize, yes, there's funds there, but what are we doing for tails into the future? And what are we still seeing on the horizon that may be a shortfall? Right.
Thanks very much. Those are great examples. Myron, I can't help but think about your time as revenue commissioner. You went around the state with your three-legged stool and tried to help people understand how the state budgets, how the financing of the state works. Talk a little bit about your sense of this question of how do we inform decision making? What's going to be important?
Well, thanks, Kathy. Actually, I have to tell a quick story about Dave. Dave became one of the co-chairs. I think Merrick Ryback was the other co-chair with you, right, Dave? So he was a co-chair of the governor Dayton's mayor's task force on tax reform. And so I went up to see Dave in St. Cloud. I did my first radio show with Dave, and he's really good. Thank you for that. I learned about radio, and I obviously have a face for radio, as they say, but I think it was a lot of fun. But part of that experience really was we were trying to figure out why did we have deficit after deficit after deficit? We had a decade of deficits actually leading up to 2010. We had and in 2011, we had a $6 billion budget deficit, just staggering to think about that. And so we went around the state and started talking to people, explaining, well, our sales tax revenue continues to not perform well. Our property tax is overperforming, and 40% of our 3 state sources of revenue were coming from property taxes, which is very regressive, not the way you want to do it. And our income tax was lagging behind. And so we went around and explained to people, here are the facts, and you agree there's a problem. And people pretty much agreed, yes, there's a revenue problem, because people didn't want to cut services, right? I mean, so there's 2 ways to balance your budget. You can cut spending, or you can bring in new revenue. Everyone pretty much agreed we have a revenue problem. We need more revenue. And Governor Dayton's proposal was to increase income tax on the 4th income tax tier, the top 2% of wage income earners. And I will say we've been in surpluses pretty much ever since. And so that experience, though, taught me a number of things. And Dave's right. You have to have the technicians there to make sure that you understand how to do this stuff. And you need to listen to people. I'm most concerned about, and Tonya mentioned this, I'm most concerned about putting money in the same old things we've done before and expecting something to change, and it's not necessarily going to change. And so I think we need to figure out a way to listen to communities and the people who are experiencing these problems that aren't being resolved, whether it's the education achievement gap, or what attainment gap, or whether it's community disparities, health disparities. We have been designing things from the top down so often, and I think one of the things Mary Brainerd said this once in a meeting, former head of Health Partners, if you're talking about patient care and you don't have a patient in the room, then you're probably not going to get it exactly right. And so I think the challenge would be this time, we need to sort of do some of this, I think, setting the record straight about where we are, leveling that understanding, but we need to invite people in a different way, because if President Biden's package in any form gets passed, these opportunities to really change community funding and community services in schools, community schools, for example, are potentially transformational. But there are forces out there, and I don't mean to be derogatory or negative, but there are forces out there who just want to continue to spend money the way that we are. And that's not working. I mean, it's to some extent it is, obviously, but it's not solving some of these major disparities that we have. So until we figure out a way to capture the essence of what the experience is and what it's like to live and experience these problems, I don't think we'll design the right programs. And that's where I think I want to welcome Tonya to Minnesota, and invite you over to the University of Minnesota, and I'll show you around anytime you want to come over. I'll invite you here, but I think the community aspect of this, solving this problem, is just critical. People are thirsty for facts. They want to hear what's going on. They want to be involved, and they've got ideas, and we need to listen.
Thanks, Myron. Tonya, I do want to turn it to you to ask that or follow-up question. I think in philanthropy, there's a lot of attention to input from those who we're looking to serve. Talk a little bit about how to do that kind of listening at the scale that we need to be talking about in this context. It's, as both the mayor and Myron have shared their stories, government has a different challenge in terms of where its attention needs to be, both the technicians and the politicians who have to be listening in a different way. But as you think about listening to inform solutions, to inform the creation of new solutions, just talk a little bit about what either you're excited about or you're anxious about in terms of being able to do that at the scale we're talking about.
Yeah, well, I am anxious about it because we do need to do it at broad scale. And nationally, what many people are talking about is, quite honestly, having the Biden administration mandate community advisory boards. But what I would say, instead of forcing a one size fits all, I think what we ought to do in Minnesota is really take advantage of the nonprofit infrastructure that we built. I heard someone say recently, we're the state of a 10,000
nonprofits
and 10,000 nonprofits too. And so I thought that was fun, but nevertheless, so many of these organizations have been equipped in building the capacity and the muscle to engage community. And we need to engage the broad spectrum of it. So we got to make sure that we get BIPOC members of our community in this. We need to make sure we have small rural communities, small business owners. And so if we use that infrastructure, we get clear about what it is that we want to achieve. If we really want to do human-centered design, where we put people right at the center, telling their experiences, articulating what they can do differently, what we could do differently as government, and quite honestly, giving them support, because many of them have gotten influx of cash that they haven't ever had before, particularly our most vulnerable families in our state. So how do they use those resources and the ones that will be coming in a different way that really makes it transformational for them? How does government support them? And I think if we were to use that nonprofit infrastructure and get really clear about what we want to have answers and solutions to, that we can set up the framing around that. And then the last thing I would say is that if we want to get resources out, distributed more equitably to these communities as well, then we have to support the nonprofits who have to distribute the resources. Government is set up to take government dollars. Nonprofits aren't. And it does create an additional burden on them. And that's a place where I actually think that philanthropy should be leaning in to make sure that we enable and create that kind of enabling environment that government needs to be able to deploy these resources effectively, to engage community effectively, and for us to pivot towards the future. Because this is our moment. We don't get to, the future is created now and we know it's not finished. So here's the moment to finish our future.
So we got a question from someone who's watching that it's a bit of an invitation to dream, back to Tonya's opening comments. And I'm going to ask each of you to reflect on this, and we won't hold you to the prediction. But the question from Asada is, which sector do you anticipate may see the most notable transformation based on both the year we've just been through and the anticipation of increased funding and some renewed prioritization? Where do you each imagine the most transformation? And again, back to Dave's earlier point, you really do have to put the two pieces together. The experience of the last 18 months, pandemic-induced civil unrest, and now this moment of investment. Pick your sector that you think will have the most notable transformation. Who wants to go first?
I'll jump in with, I think, families. I think that if we really, with the investment in, the continuation of the child tax credit, but also in opportunities and for, lead, cleaning out the lead in the water structure, and making prevailing wages. And also providing better health care in different communities. And housing, affordable housing. When you start doing a lot of these things at the same time, I think ultimately families are going to be the ones that will benefit the most in terms of stability, of jobs, of income, of housing and healthcare, mental health. Those I think, the fundamental change that could bring to families, to have that sort of ongoing certainty about their lives that they don't have now, I think is truly an amazing opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Myron.
And
Tonya.
I think, Kathy, I think what we'll see is infrastructure will be significantly different. I think that the movement that we see around climate and clean energy is nothing we've ever seen before at the scale we have. So when we start actually changing our power grid, when we start really putting in electric vehicles across all of our fleets, putting in charging stations across the country and across our state, I think that actually is going to really reshift the way that we think about power, the way that we think about our climate, how we think about our environment. Minnesota, as you all know, is more advanced than most states, and particularly the most advanced in the Midwest. But I think that industry will really shift. It's going to move. There's going to be lots of money there as well. And I think what our challenge before us is to make sure that as we're making that investment in it, really seeing it, be it families, be it in our infrastructure, we have to make sure that this is equitable across the board. We got to make sure there's a through line of racial equity as we think through this, because if we don't, then none of it's going to be durable, or we recreate the systems where some are advantaged and some are deeply burdened. And this is the moment where we actually, I believe, can tilt the universe so that we actually don't do that again, that we really are repairing the harms that we've created in the past. And that's not blame. This is about how do we step in our leadership moment to do what's right for every single Minnesotan.
Yeah. I have to just insert here that Tonya is on an advisory board for the General Motors, and I have the honor of serving on the McKnight board. And at our conversation about climate, we had the president of General Motors come in and talk about their decisions around electrification. Tonya, it brings a level of sophistication about leadership on some of these issues that I'm just thrilled that we have her leadership now in our community. So thanks for that comment, Tonya. Mayor, how about you? Which sector can you imagine changing the most?
Well, I think the sector I would hope would change the most is the government sector. That's my hope. But the challenge is as we get out of this, I see a lot of those same patterns going back in, doing the things we always do. On Tonya's point, although the private sector, for us, we received a lot of, in addition to the other dollars through the CARES Act, we received a lot of money through the CDBG, our community development block grants as an entitlement city. We relied almost entirely on where those dollars would go in the nonprofits. I mean, that's who made those decisions, because for us, it's more of a pass through. We don't do a lot of social services, and we found that fortunately we don't, because during the revenue shortfalls, that would have been the most challenging for us. So I think there's a little bit more of an understanding of where those dollars and who can direct those dollars the most, the folks that are closest to it. Government transformation, to me, where I think it needs to happen, is in the last year and a half, and there's discussion at the state level, at the local level on that power. But we had, as a mayor, I had a lot of opportunities to shift resources around, including human resources that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do because of our structure, through our labor contracts and all of the other things that we weren't able to be as creative and innovative with. Now, we had a different structure. Of course, every time I extended my powers, the council had to agree with that to do that. But once that ended, which was just weeks ago, now we're back into going through, I mentioned before about trying to get lifeguards. In the private sector, you could just raise the wages to meet the demand. And, for us, we have to go through an ordinance change. It makes it very difficult to do that. We have a lot of employees now that we're working remote. We lose that ability now because as government, again, now we've got to be back in person. So we're going through some policy changes, but I think to have that, especially the local government, the government structure, be more able to adapt quicker and change that, because we have to. Our service with the revenue shortfall we realized over the last year and a half, we can do some things pretty creative and actually adapt to help with the business community or individuals and homeowners, but and renters to do that. But now we're back into that old system again. So to me, I think there was a realization that some of that helped. It helped us get through a really tough time. And now we're back into that same system of this is what we have, go through. It's very bureaucratic and, and it's a system that I think needs to change. And I think it will, because I think we've seen that. Clearly our folks have seen that if we can adapt more, change that to be more rapid in our ability to respond and to create a much more partnerships whether it's with the nonprofits, with folks that actually can see what government oftentimes doesn't see as quickly and can distribute some of those funds. So I think that sector needs to change the most, and I think it will.
Kathy, I might just jump in there. I think Dave's really hit on an important point, and the further I get away from state service, the more of an expert I become. Right. So,
right. Perspective.
Right. So, but one of the things that Governor Dayton's struggled with this current structure of state government hasn't changed in a long time. And in Governor Walz, I worked with Governor Walz and his talented Chief of Staff, Chris Schmitter, on some redesign changes and coming up with metrics. How are we doing? How do we measure whether government's effective, whether programs are effective or not, and really deciding what are the primary deliverables for these different agencies. And part of that discussion was developing dashboards, but also developing, is this the right way to deliver services? And I think one of the things about the city, I think, at least I hope, Mayor, you've got some more flexibility in the state government. I think one of the things that we have burdened ourselves with is a structure that's been around for, I don't know, it really hasn't changed significantly in years. How do we do that in a way that provides for the innovation and the creativity to meet these challenges like this? And so I think Governor Walz is committed to thinking about better ways and more effective ways to make that interconnection with the community and with government. But that's got to happen. You're right.
Yeah. In fact, you're catching up with a comment from Kurt Johnson, who an innovator in government for many years, and he was sort of poking at the same thing. How do we get out of thinking of this time as catch up and in fact think about the future and reimagining? But reimagining it in government it's not organized to do that, right? And so we're back again to this question of how do we make sure there are people informing the process going forward that enable us to imagine differently. And Mayor, you talked about it at the local level. More thoughts about how that can happen at the state level. How do we give ourselves the opportunity?
Well, working out at the university with President Gable, we're undergoing somewhat the same process to go through an initiative now to kind of redesign how we support teaching, research, and service, and how we make that connection with the state. It's all about communication, right? And so it's easy to say that word, but that word is really an active word. Now, I think that we've got to establish, and Tonya mentioned this earlier, we've got to establish some dialogue now before the money shows up, and we've got to start having these conversations that none of us know the answer to. I mean, that's part of the problem. It's easier to set up these conversations when you sort of know what you think how you want to come out on the other end.
Right.
But we need to be honest about entering this conversation. If the size of some of this Biden package actually comes through, this is major opportunity, and we can't let it pass. Well, Tonya, you said it well. We're creating the future. If we don't do it right, well, shame on us. And so we've got to have that openness and honesty to get together and communicate but make sure we have the right people in that room. And I think that's why things like this, Kathy, are really helpful to start those conversations, to get people thinking about it.
Yep. Yeah, and again, it was very much our intention to, as I said in the invitation, it's too early to talk about details of what's going to happen with all this money, but it's not too early to start talking about who needs to be in conversation, who needs to be engaged in parts of this discussion. Another entry into the Q&A here is someone who has a very specific idea around improving access to housing and home ownership. And so those ideas are out there, as a couple of you have acknowledged through the course of our discussion. How do we capture those? How do we make sure they get into meaningful circles of how decisions are going to get made going forward? So we will have more of these conversations as we go forward. I'm going to do a quick, go ahead, Tonya.
Kathy, I would just say, I think one of the things that might be interesting, and I don't know, I'm new to town, so I can say stuff that sounds crazy and naive, but I just wonder, like, what would it take for us as a state, for us as leaders across the state, to decide to put our weapons down, put our partisan caps down, like take all of our armor off, and really take a moment to really rethink. What would it look like if we were to say we want to have the most inclusive and robust economy in the country? And what does it look like if we were to ask some of the organizations that may be caring for different parts of the region to come together to work on that, like Itasca or Greater MSP and others that are working in Greater Minnesota, to say, look, we have to take this moment. If we had a force rank, what the top 5 priorities would be that actually lift every Minnesotan and actually allows us to grow our revenue base for government, for families, for everybody. What does that look like? How do we create that space? And that's not of course we need the condonement of our leaders, our state leaders on that. But what we need is the fortitude of those who have the ability, to rewrite the rules. And many of us have that power and never utilize it. And I just would say, this is the moment, if there's never ever been one in the last few decades, to do it now and to spend the time really asking ourselves, are we gonna design the future, or are we gonna let it, or are we just gonna inherit it? And so I just wanna emphasize that again, that this is that moment, and we are the people we've been looking for. We are the leaders. We are the ones who can create that convening. We are the leaders that can create that conversation, that can facilitate these relationships. Yep. So
thank you,
Myron, Mayor, I'm giving it to you.
There's at the risk of bringing this down to a very different conversation, I think there's another comment in the feed that I want to share, because I think it's an important reminder that the context of what we're all going through is really important to remember. The details are yet to come. We'll learn more in the coming months and years about exactly how the money is going to flow. But John Appett's raised an important context question. Current federal debt is it 10 trillion? No, is that right? Could this major new spending drive the US into another major recession, or in the alternative, actually stimulate enough economic activity to produce significant new revenue, or doesn't it really matter? What do you think, Myron?
And I say unequivocally that cutting taxes does not generate economic activity, in my particular view. What does stimulate economic activity is stimulus and investment. And so I really do believe that the underlying concept of Biden's infrastructure jobs plan does provide the opportunity for increased economic activity in a way that I think could spur increased economic activity and eventually start paying down this tremendous debt. So I think we're on the right track. And you don't get something without paying for it. And so the corollary, though, is that there's an increase in the corporate tax and some other areas that Biden has mentioned, and we've got to be honest about that. Investment means revenue. You cannot do these changes without having the revenue to support it. So let's be honest about that. And I think it works, personally.
Yeah. Mayor, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, well, the debt part always worries me, and it always has for decades, because it's not. But I would probably go back to what what Myron said earlier, I mean, if we keep doing things, keep spending things the way we always have, the way the systems are, yeah, that worries me even more. You've got to create some creativity. I agree wholeheartedly with what Tonya said about getting and envisioning and really seeing what you want to do. It's the mechanisms at the state, and for us, we can do a lot of things locally, but we often get hindered by state policies. I mean, we're trying to do some things with infrastructure, despite all of the dollars that we have, by doing something local. And we have to ask the permission from the state to do, even if we want to raise revenue and sales tax or whatever it may be. And there are a lot of things that hinder us. We've been very creative in a number of ways to try to innovate. And then the restriction, again, that it comes down to I think you need more laboratories. I mean, that's the United States. I mean, the states are the laboratory of creativity. I think you need more of that at the local level too, and less restrictive. But I think I agree wholeheartedly that you have to just do things differently with the dollars. And there are a lot of folks I sense it with my council of community. You just keep putting dollars into the same system and expect different results coming out. We need to look at, and that's why for us, the fact that we had a revenue shortfall last year and we didn't expect, there's a lot of discussion about whether there'd be federal funds. We weren't going to wait around for that. We've tried to create those changes now. I'm a little concerned about, with all of the influx of federal dollars, that creativity that becomes out of a necessity is going to because now we have all those dollars. We're kind of, we go into those habits. We'll plug those dollars into here. These are folks who've been asking this for a long time without creating the creativity. I think we really do need to do a lot of that visioning at that local level. But I think that's where it's done best, where the more local it is, the more you can have those conversations, the better it is. So to my former colleagues at the state and for the folks that we lobby for, a lot more flexibility at the local level, because that's the way we're going to be able to do that visioning.
Yeah, wonderful insight. Thank you. I'm mindful of time, and we've got just a few minutes left. I want to say thank you to each of you, and remind or repeat something I said at the top. We knew this was a 30,000 foot conversation, because that's kind of that's the state of play in terms of a lot of this funding. We expect to invite people back for conversations as details become clearer on various aspects of this. But I'm taking away a couple of important learnings, and I'll look forward to continuing these conversations with all of you. I want to ask my colleague, Emily McGrath, to come on and just share a little bit about how Tunheim will be doing its job as we work through this coming period. Emily?
Yes. Hi. Tunheim does integrated public relations and public affairs across many sectors. So in the coming months, we will be continuing to monitor all these different topics and its details become more clear. We will certainly be watching them and working with the Minnesota community to figure out how best to invest these dollars. And we also, as Kathy mentioned, plan to reconvene or convene similar conversations on each of these topics at critical junctures.
We'll look forward to bringing people back together to talk about these. And as we see insights and updates about details, we'll be posting them. So be watching for those, all of you who've been good enough to register to join us today. I want to just again thank our guests, Mayor Kleis from St. Cloud, Myron Frans, University of Minnesota, Tonya Allen, McKnight Foundation. Thanks to each of you. Thanks to everybody who tuned in, and watch for more. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.